Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. Last October, Hamas and Israel agreed to a 20-point ceasefire plan in Gaza, put forward by the Trump administration. And days later, President Donald Trump traveled to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt for a showy signing ceremony of a memorandum committing the U.S. and 3 regional governments to supporting the ceasefire. The phrase, peace in the Middle East, was conspicuously displayed behind the 4 leaders. Nearly 4 months later, Washington announced that Phase 2 of the Gaza plan is underway. But what does the situation actually look like on the ground? What has transpired in the interim? And what still needs to happen for the conflict resolution process to live up to its lofty promises? To help us think through these questions, we've invited back onto the show our colleague, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen. Lucy is a senior fellow with the Middle East Institute and an expert on U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, regional conflict dynamics, and civil society peacebuilding efforts. Prior to joining MEI, she served at the U.S. Institute of Peace for 15 years, where she directed work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Ganul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Lucy, thank you very much for joining us on Middle East Focus.
Of course, thanks for having me back.
So for our listeners, we are recording on the afternoon of January 27th. But what is the situation like on the ground in Gaza, nearly 4 months since the signing of the 20-point plan on ending the conflict?
Thanks, Matt. Well, I think the brief way to answer that is that it is far better than it was, but there's a long way to go before we're looking at something that any of us who care about the future of Palestinians and Palestine, Israelis and Israel, because ultimately those two fates and futures are intertwined. It's a long way to go before any of us should feel comfortable with where things are. I think it probably bears reminding ourselves sort of the extent of the damage and the devastation that had occurred. It was about 90% estimated of housing structures damaged and destroyed, about 70% of all infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of students have been going without education, 95% of educational facilities destroyed, less than half of pre-existing hospitals and health facilities functioning, poor sanitation that flows from all of that, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the one other thing I'd like to add right now as we think about what things are like on the ground and what that means for moving forward, and maybe this is particularly on my mind today as we sit here in a very snowy, wintry Washington, right, where some of us are snowed in even. It's been a particularly brutal winter there in the region. Heavy rains, winds, cold. And if we think about the fact, given the statistics I just cited on damaged infrastructure and housing, most Gazans have been in temporary shelters. And with those winter conditions in particular, and all the materials and supplies needed that are not yet fully coming in, what that means is you've got flooding. You've had tents that have flooded because you don't have all the supplies coming in and the technical capacity to fix things like wastewater treatment plants. It means that flooding has been mixed with untreated wastewater. All those implications of what the situation is on the ground right now are things that will have long-lasting effects.
Maybe you could also get in a little bit into the security conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, let's take a look at sort of who's in control from a security perspective right now. Israel controls about 53% of the territory. The lines that were drawn in accordance at the end of the ceasefire plan, in accordance with the 20-point plan, there's this so-called yellow line dividing the strip. To the east of the yellow line, that's where Israel has control. Again, it's about 53% of the territory. The rest is effectively controlled by Hamas still. So, assuring secure routes for things like aid getting through as it needs to and reaching the people that need it on the ground is not something to be assured right now. I think that, Hamas has been able to stand itself back up in a way that it can exercise control and authority in more so than any other actor there on the ground. You may recall that right after the ceasefire was announced, there were some pretty deliberately publicized executions by Hamas of anybody who'd been sort of standing up trying to assert alternative control. And so this is, again, it's a post-conflict devastated society with all the implications for, crime, certainly, and looting still, though that is down. Again, Hamas is asserting a fair amount of control. And to the east side of the yellow line, as mentioned, the IDF is there. But in terms of this feeling like a secure environment in any way for the people living there, whether at the hands of those who are controlling it to east or west, and just in terms of the ability, right, to have the kind of structures in place that allow for rule of law and safe communities. Again, something where there is a long way to go.
Lucy, the Trump administration had previously announced the launch of the second phase of the Gaza peace plan earlier in January. But now, with the return of the body of the last deceased hostage taken in the October 7th attacks on January 26th, it looks like that may finally happen. Are we likely to see a move to phase two at this point? And what exactly would that entail?
Yeah, I mean, the second part of that question is the big one. I think that, yes, as you referenced, phase two was formally announced a little over a week ago, and that was even before the return of Rangvili, who was as you mentioned, he was the last hostage who hadn't either returned or, in his case, whose remains had not been repatriated. That officially, in theory, would mark the end of phase two. Although, again, all of this phase one, phase two distinction has been a little fluid from the beginning, because there are other things that I'm sure we'll talk about that had been envisioned as part of phase one, opening of the Rafah crossing. Always been some ambiguity about the disarmament process. Again, something I'm sure we'll get to talk about later in the conversation. But the U.S. basically put its foot down, the U.S. administration last week, and said, with or without the return yet of Rangvili's remains, we're moving on to phase two. And they launched that announcement with also announcing the standing up of this Palestinian Technocratic Committee, now referred to as the NCAG, the National Committee for Administration of Gaza. And so now the question is, as you ask, Alistair, so what does that mean? There are a lot of unknowns still. We talked about security just now. And again, I think I should note that while the ceasefire was basically in effect and things were better than they had been, we still had been seeing, when we talk about security, there have been, I think, over 400 Palestinians killed since the implementation of the ceasefire, 3 Israeli soldiers killed. You've had both sides trading accusations of violating terms of the ceasefire. And so is this going to, formally come to an end now, especially now that we've had the announcement of the Board of Peace, the return of Rangvili? Does this give more heft to the U.S. saying, let's move on to phase two? But again, in phase two, International Stabilization Force, there's still a lot of unknowns about that. Who will be the members? There's nobody formally signed on yet. What will be its mandate? The fact that we don't know that is a reason that most countries haven't signed on, or nobody has signed on. What does deployment of police and civil servants look like? And the big question of disarmament. Israel, Netanyahu has said disarmament has to happen as far as they're concerned before we start to move to reconstruction. Also, something envisioned for phase two. U.S. officials have been echoing that line. But again, disarmament, what's the process, under whose auspices, who's monitoring it, what does it look like? All of these are questions that are still up in the air.
I wanted to ask about one of the other things that you touched on, which was the opening of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office has said that the border crossing will open, but only for pedestrians and not humanitarian aid or commercial goods. If that's the case, how much of a difference is that likely to make? What sort of a practical difference will that potentially make?
Well, again, opening it will make a difference. Even if the difference is not maximal or optimal, the difference you'll see is that Rafah is the crossing of the 5 crossings that are into and out of Gaza. 4 of those are between Israel and Gaza. Rafah is the one that opens Gaza to the outside world through a different country, through Egypt. Prior to its closure, and probably, or not just probably, definitely a lot of damage on the Gazan side of the crossing since October 7th. That was where movement of mostly people, but also goods, had been coming in and out. It does not have the capacity of some of the other crossings, Kerem Shalom or Kerem Abu Salem, which has more capacity for goods coming in and out. But again, any opening, any additional access point for movement of people and goods is going to make a difference. Now, if we're talking just people, the other question to have in mind here, and this has been a question since this first came up, this came up again recently of when the crossing was going to be opened, is will it be open in both directions? That's definitely what Egypt and other actors are insisting on, and this is particularly sensitive. Because we may recall that at the beginning of the Trump administration, Trump had called very controversially for sort of letting all Gazans out, sending Gazans elsewhere. And very soon after they're back, it's actually what prompted the Egyptians, and then later adopted by the Arab League, to come up, and the Arab states to come up with a plan that ensured that Gazans could actually stay in Gaza. But of course, it will clang alarm bells if Rafah crossing is only opened in one direction to allow Gazans to come out Egypt. There are many waiting to, again, this would be the primary crossing for those needing medical care, trying to get out for medical care in Egypt and elsewhere beyond Egypt. So it will be meaningful. Again, this was actually envisioned as being part of phase 1. And, what remains to be seen in the next couple of days is, will it be open fully in both directions? And then there'll be all sorts of questions about who will be on the other side, right? Who will be on the Gazan side, both immediately and longer term of that Rafah crossing.
Lucy, you had mentioned the issue of Hamas's disarmament earlier. It's probably safe to say that it is perhaps one of the most difficult issues to address in this phase 2 of the Gaza plan. Where do we stand on that today?
Right. So this is one of the big issues, potentially the biggest, though there are many big issues, of course, in the 20-point plan. Israel has insisted, I mentioned just a little earlier, that nothing else can happen, right? They don't want to move forward on reconstruction until Hamas agrees to disarm. There's been a lot of ambiguity from the Hamas side about their willingness to do so. They've at times actually suggested conditional willingness to disarm, but that condition has been when there's a Palestinian state. Now, that's a long-term, non-bounded timeline right now, so that doesn't sound certainly like an immediate willingness to do that. And we should recall as well that the ambiguity was built in from the beginning as to whether they ever agreed to it at the outset of the agreement. Trump basically, to kick the agreement over the ceasefire over the finish line, said yes, on a handshake, a literal handshake, they agreed, they're going to do it. But there were no timelines and terms put down on that. And so this has resulted in this very fuzzy situation where Trump insisted that the ceasefire was going to move ahead and we were going to march through these steps, and that we'd basically figure out. There's been a lot of heavy bellicose rhetoric, both from Israel and echoed by the Trump administration, of Hamas can do this the easy way or the hard way. But again, no specifics of what either the easy way or the hard way would look like. And one of the things I think we want to keep in mind here, that I keep coming back to, is that processes of disarmament, demilitarization, demobilization in other conflict contexts take a long time, right? There isn't really a good example that I can think of where this has been an instantaneous process. I tend to go to the Northern Ireland example, where after the Good Friday Agreement, I believe it was about 3 years between Good Friday Agreement and IRA disarmament, longer again, before you had sort of loyalist groups disarming. So it was about a decade between Good Friday Agreement and the full process. So could that be the kind of thing we're looking at here? Possibly. There's some reports that suggest Hamas is open to decommissioning offensive weapons, storing their arsenal. Will that be good enough for Israel if that's seen as a temporary measure? And the other question, the last thing I'll say on this for now, is who are they handing them over to? And this is where the question has come up of, does that need to be handing it over to another Palestinian force? And if so, who comprises that force? Perhaps the standing up of the MCAS that I mentioned, the Committee for Administration of Gaza, is a start to answering that question. But again, a lot of question marks and no solid answers yet.
Does some sort of magic collection of incentives or pressures exist that would compel Hamas to go through with this disarmament? Who actually has leverage over the group, and are they willing to exercise it?
Well, the other thing that was written into the 20-point plan from the beginning was this idea that that Hamas fighters who would give up their arms could be offered amnesty or safe passage out of Gaza. That again, it's enshrined in the 20-point plan, which in turn was adopted and enshrined in the UN Security Council Resolution 2803 that was adopted a couple of months ago. Again, the theme of this conversation, no details on that, timeline or otherwise, but that's one of the keys that could unlock this. Ultimately, who has authority? The way things are being structured right now, and particularly maybe if we get to talking about the Board of Peace, this will be another theme that Trump and the American administration seems to hold a lot of the keys to authority, incentives, and overall power to move this forward. But again, in coordination and conjunction with other actors. And I think the idea of bringing in very much from the beginning Qatar and Turkey into the mix here, both in terms of the Board of Peace and their involvement in the ceasefire. The theory behind that, from the United States perspective, is these are two actors that do have leverage to bear, do have power, do have influence with Hamas. Arguably, they were responsible for helping get Hamas over the finish line of agreeing to a ceasefire to start with. So that's where some of those keys lie. But again, no easy answers.
Just earlier today, January 27th, we had reporting from Reuters that Hamas had said it would be willing to integrate its 10,000-strong local police force into any sort of post-war Gaza regular police. Israel undoubtedly would object to this. But there is a certain precedent for integrating former fighters into security forces in a post-conflict zone. So do you think this could be some sort of realistic way forward in the Gaza case? And what obstacles would have to be addressed or overcome for such a solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned what the obstacles and understandably so to this would be. I mean, as you say, this is not without precedent. This is often what you've seen in other conflict contexts. When you have a process of DDR, you've had this integration of former fighters into new structures of authority. Obstacles would be, the need for a vetting process. Certainly, Israel would want to insist and want to understand more about, what's the nature of these? Are these folks who were just sort of on the payroll, weren't senior leadership, weren't senior fighters, but, Hamas has been in charge of the Strip since 2007. You've had many people operating as civil servants and security personnel under Hamas governance. So I think it would require a heavy vetting process for certainly Israel to feel secure that this is a workable arrangement. But again, I think that because there have been no details put on the table, probably all options are on the table. And I would imagine that there will be a lot of looking to prior conflict DDR contexts into how this has been done, what's been effective, and what has not worked as well.
Under Phase 2, the IDF is supposed to remove its remaining forces, or at least the bulk of them, from the rest of Gaza. But if it does not, or if it slow rolls such a withdrawal, how would that likely affect further progress on other aspects of the Gaza plan?
Right. So this is, again, another of those that sort of has no timeline built into the 20-point plan. And the question is one of how temporary and transitional, right, is the current arrangement. The way the 20-point plan is written is that the current arrangement, current structures the Board of Peace, the eventual International Stabilization Force, are all transitional structures that will oversee a training up of local Palestinian governance and forces, a reformed, eventually, again, no specific timeline, but eventually a reformed Palestinian authority that then would be able to take on leadership, ownership of Gaza governance itself. But that will only be realized, of course, when you don't have Israel occupying the Strip. And so that will be a significant barrier, not just to the trust and sense of security of Palestinians on the ground there living in Gaza, but I think it will also have significant implications for what can be done in terms of reconstruction, etc. And I say that because there's a heavy reluctance, having gone through seen rounds over several years of Israel-Hamas fighting and devastation and destruction of Gaza that has gotten worse at almost every time. Countries who would be the ones expected to invest in reconstruction and rebuilding of the Strip are reluctant to pour more in if they think that the likelihood is another flare-up, another military conflagration, and all those resources poured into rebuilding going to waste. Now, there are some who may say, well, isn't it a surer bet? Aren't the IDF able to assure more control than, say, any kind of nascent Palestinian force? But of course, this butts up against other regional actors and international allied goals and expectations that at the end of the day, this arrangement is moving towards a unoccupied by Israel Gaza and a move towards a future that, again, as envisioned in the 20-point plan, is a very qualified statement about, but still a statement about the eventual consideration of a Palestinian state governed by and run by Palestinians. So again, the questions that remain around how temporary, how transitional is this current arrangement is really going to inject, I think, some paralysis into other actors' willingness to invest full force in the future of Gaza until they know what the end game is and what the exit strategy looks like.
And you had mentioned the International Stabilization Force, or the ISF, earlier. Where do things stand with that, very briefly, and what exactly would its mission be currently?
Yes, this is the one that really is taking a while to get off the ground again. We've seen some traction, as we've said, on the Board of Peace recently, but the ISF is still floundering in terms of when will it be deployed, who will comprise it. And the challenge here has been, again, one of ambiguity, word of the day, around mandate and mission. I think that it was initially conceived of as a force that would help oversee security stabilization of the Strip, that it would be a multinational force. It would have as contributors, ideally, participants from Arab and Muslim nations, the idea being that they would be the more appropriate participants to engage with Gazans in this context. But because there are no specifics about the mission, will they just be peacekeeping? Will they be expected to disarm Hamas? There's been a lot of reluctance for countries to sign up. Now, the U.S. has announced the appointment of a U.S. general, a two-star general, General Jeffers, to lead the ISF, which is interesting because the administration has also said all along there will be no U.S. boots on the ground. So presumably, if he's keeping to that, this will be commanded from outside Gaza by General Jeffers. And again, I think without countries having a sense that they know what they will be required to do and what they definitely won't be asked to do, you're going to continue to see the foot dragging that you've seen to date. You've seen many walkbacks, countries that either announced they were interested or would be willing to participate, or that Trump announced on their behalf have said they'd be willing to participate, only to see a lot of direct or sort of indirect walking back in the meantime. The one exception to the hedging all along has been Turkey, who has said that they would be very willing to put boots on the ground. But for Israel, that has been a non-starter. They're concerned, given Turkey's support for Hamas and where they see its posture, Israel feels from a security perspective it cannot countenance the idea of Turkey being the force on the ground in Gaza.
Lucy, shifting gears from security to administration, you've mentioned the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, or NCAG, a couple of times in our discussion now. As part of phase two of the peace plan, governance of Gaza is set to transition from Hamas to this group of appointed technocratic Palestinian leaders. It was announced on January 15th. What do we know about the committee at this point? How is it expected to work? Who are the key personalities involved?
Yes, so that's right. This was what was originally referred to as the Palestinian Technocratic Committee that would be stood up in the 20-point plan. Now the NCAG, as you say. It was announced last week. It's 15 members, I believe. The head, the person who's appointed as the head, Ali Shath, and I should say all of these members are from Gaza originally. Ali Shath, who has been appointed the head of that committee, is formerly a minister in the Palestinian Authority and has had close ties to the Palestinian Authority. So one of the observations here has been that while Israel has had a no Hamas, no Abbas policy, meaning no Hamas in charge of Gaza, but also no PA. And so far, the Americans have not pushed back on that forcefully. The question is this a nod to that? Is this a nod to including the PA earlier? Is it what some people have termed a dotted line to the PA because of the close relationship that Ali Shath has had in the past and when he has served in the past as a PA minister? But so far, as I understand it, no members of the committee who aren't in Gaza have been into Gaza yet since they've been appointed. And given again the scope and scale of the challenges I laid out at the beginning in response to your first question, Matt, about what are the conditions on the ground, we're obviously going to need much more than 15 people attending to these problems. So to your question, Alistair, of who's involved and what does this look like, the NCAG in theory would be the day-to-day manager of these kind of these issues, the technical issues on the ground in Gaza. But they, as I understand it, given this structure as we know it at the Board of Peace right now, they're sort of the lowest on the totem pole in terms of the hierarchy. I think they are subject to reporting to the Gaza Executive Board of the Board of Peace. And clearly we'll need, again, with the scope and scale of the problems and the population in Gaza, just thinking about what's needed to manage a similar sized city, say in the United States, you're going to need many people working under that NCAG to be able to deal with utilities and trash collection and standing back up an education system and all the things that you would expect of governance. So another situation where great that we're seeing a start to this, great that you have folks appointed, will feel a lot more like progress when it's understood who will be working under them and when the work begins.
The other major actor in the governance equation is, as you referred to, the Board of Peace. Its role, I think it's fair to say, has expanded somewhat dramatically since perhaps it was originally conceived of. What do we know about what it was originally designed to do and how it's been reconceptualized in the interim?
Yeah, so the Board of Peace was first mentioned again in the 20-point plan from the Gaza ceasefire 20-point plan, and then enshrined again as that plan was in UN Security Council Resolution 2803. It was supposed to again be an administrative body that was part of this transitional governance structure in Gaza. The idea being that the Board of Peace, along with the International Stabilization Force, working with a Palestinian Technocratic Committee, would be in charge of moving Gaza through this transitional phase to eventual, sometime down the line, hand over to a Palestinian ruling authority. But as you've said, it does seem from everything we know that its mandate has expanded. It was announced the way Trump does like to announce things, on a global stage with fanfare at Davos last week, with a fair amount of, again, ambiguity, again, word of the day, or maybe less ambiguity about what it was set up to do specifically now, because it didn't really refer to in the charter as far as we're aware from what has been reported. It doesn't actually even mention Gaza. It's sort of envisioned now as this broader body that that seems to potentially compete with the UN. The UN, I think, isn't mentioned specifically in what we've seen of what was sort of leaked or rather reported as the charter, but it sort of throws some shade to the UN, other international bodies that are basically inefficient and ineffective. This will be, a way to be more agile and more nimble. It has a logo even that sort of echoes the UN logo, except that the United States is right in the center, and I think it's just a sort of Western hemisphere that you see in the map as opposed to the global map that you see.
And it's all in gold.
And it is in gold, yes, including the olive branches around it. So again, there's been a lot of commentary and questions of, is this now, and Trump's been talking about as though this is not just about Gaza, this is an opportunity to have a body run by him, President Trump, he is the chair of the board, that deals with world conflict. Gaza now happens to be one of their case studies, so it's one of those areas it would be focused on. The president is someone who's keenly attuned to the power of branding and the art of performance, and he signals accordingly. So I think that, there are questions and concerns that this is really about Trump setting up an alternative peace-building order to that which has been the sort of dominant structure, albeit certainly not effective in many ways, right, over time. But he has nodded to cooperating with the UN. But again, everything about the charter suggests that this is an ultimately Trump-controlled project. He has seemingly unlimited authority to appoint members to the board, decide if those memberships are renewed. There's a little bit of or not a little bit, there is a sort of pay-to-play element for those who want a permanent fixture on the board. I think it's that for those countries who are willing to give them $1 billion up front, they can have indefinite membership on the board. And the members so far, you have had many of the Arab states sign on. You've had a couple of South American states sign on. Most of our European allies have not. They all have exhibited wariness about this for many of the reasons that I've nodded to in my answers so far. And so it's giving people pause, even as it suggests some progress is being made on the 20-point plan. But again, there seems a lot of unknowns on this one right now, too, and a lot of elements that are giving people concern.
The Board of Peace was unveiled at Davos, as you mentioned, and quickly got, I think, kind of caught up in broader Trumpian fights with European allies over NATO and Greenland, and kind of spat with the Canadian Prime Minister. Can they get this off the ground, do you think? And if not, what does that actually mean for making progress on Gaza specifically?
Yeah, look, the countries that have come out and said that they will join, and particularly to look at the Arab states, I think that there is a real sense of urgency to get something moving that is constructive. So all shade aside, and legitimately so on the concerns that exist, there is a value to having buy-in from international actors right now on this sizable problem. And it was unveiled as well with a plan by Jared Kushner, who is on the executive board of the Board of Peace and on the Gaza executive board. It was unveiled more or less alongside that with a plan for rebuilding Gaza and, reconstructing it. A lot of lofty goals and visions, and the question is, with the imprimatur motivation of the President of the United States, can progress be forced where there would otherwise be obstacles? I think you're seeing some interesting, when you talk about what progress would look like, there was a lot of cynicism thrown at Kushner's reconstruction plan. I think he suggests that it would take 3 years to get part of it going. The UN, he's derided the UN numbers that have said you couldn't possibly clear the rubble and demine for at least 7 years or so. He's thrown back that that's ridiculous. They've shown that you can make progress. They've shown you can get things done. They've had a team of mostly private sector, real estate investment types working on this, along with the sort of international policy and diplomatic types have been working with. But it is important to remember as well that I think that Steve Witkoff, also part of the executive board of Gaza, of the Gaza executive committee of the board, when he first went to Gaza, I think he said, wow, this place is destroyed and is going to need at least 10 to 15 years. So where the truth lies, what can possibly be done with the scale of the problem, even with the best of intentions and the best of efforts, I think remains to be seen. I think that it incredibly strains reality right now to think of seeing the kind of progress that is being projected on the ground with all these unanswered questions that we've talked about. What does security look like? What are timelines for further withdrawal? What countries are willing to buy in, either by putting boots on the ground with the ISF or putting money towards reconstruction without any of these questions answered? So again, I think progress should be applauded and encouraged in terms of keeping international actors focused on this issue. And focused on it as a priority. When Trump asserts something as a priority, as we have seen, countries tend to respond. But the question here is this one where they're saying yes to avoid saying no, but playing for time in terms of putting any meaningful effort and action into it? Or can we start to see meaningful pressure put on the things that will need to start unlocking? You start to unlock before you can see rebuilding, the demilitarization, a plan for security, a plan for governance on the ground in Gaza. All of these are going to be necessary in order to start seeing anything meaningful happen that looks anything akin to where Jared Kushner's plan is heading.
Lucy, in the middle of 2025, Egypt put forward what came to be called either the Cairo Plan or later the Arab Plan for Reconstruction. One of our colleagues, Murat Mabrouk, has held it up as a possible solution for how to go about actually rebuilding Gaza. Regardless of its certain weaknesses, there's a level of detail in it that is not present in many of the other plans put forward from various places. Do you think that in a time like this, it could be taken off the shelf to start reconstruction efforts? And given Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration that no reconstruction can start until demilitarization of the Gaza Strip happens, do you expect that maybe the U.S. government will put enough pressure on Israel to have it back down on that and allow reconstruction to begin even before the full demilitarization of the zone?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is what I was getting at in my last question, is where there is a will by the United States, they have shown that President Trump has shown that he will push back. Even, the announcement of moving to phase 2, I think Netanyahu did not want to formally announce or be seen to be moving to phase 2, or feel that phase 2 was being moved to without having addressed some of these other questions of, again, at the time, the return of Iran Gvili's remains, also answers about demilitarization, disarmament of Hamas, and Trump effectively said, we're moving on. So the president has shown willingness at times to push back on what he sees as obstacles being put up by the Israeli government. In terms of the Cairo plan, can it be used, can be taken off the shelf? I would argue it has been. I mean, in many ways, the 20-point plan was made possible by this kind of work that was done already in the Cairo plan and by other actors in the New York Declaration that was initially a Saudi and French initiative and sort of broadened to a larger, this New York Declaration plan. And I think this is a situation that's not a bad model when other actors sort of do the homework, flesh out the details, and hand it to the American administration to move forward with its heft and announce it as their own. It's certainly something that Trump likes to take ownership of things. A sort of a bright spot of this administration, I would say, has not been sort of attending to the devil in the details. And so whereas your 20-point plan talks about reconstruction, it doesn't talk about how. And that's what the Cairo plan has done. I mean, the Cairo plan, it was a multi-year initiative. It envisioned, I forget what the time frame process was for it, but all the elements that will be part of any reconstruction plan are there. So it may not even have to be taken down off the shelf. It may already be off the shelf and incorporated into some of the vision that is embedded in what Jared Kushner is talking about right now. And I think I maybe mentioned before, the motivation for this plan came about when Egypt got very concerned that the only alternative plan out there was Trump saying, Gaza's done for, there's nothing to be done, let's just move all Palestinians out of Gaza. It really lit a fire. It generated this momentum. And I don't actually think there's an alternative that I'm aware of to at least the start that Cairo made with that plan. So I think we can expect, bottom line, the homework that's already been done on that to find its way into whatever the U.S. administration ends up doing.
Lucy, we've covered a lot of ground in today's conversation, but before we wrap up, I wanted to get your concluding thoughts. I think it's fair to say that the clear through line in our conversation has been uncertainty. There are a lot of key questions that remain unanswered at this point, from security and governance to reconstruction. Before we close, though, I do want to ask you, what's your outlook moving forward? Where do you see things going from here?
Again, through line of the day has been uncertainty, ambiguity, many unanswered questions. What I will be looking for is momentum, is attention sustained. Does this go beyond announce the standing up of a body, make big pronouncements, design a logo, and move on? If it is not that, and pressure is brought to bear on the various actors, all of whom have a vested stake in seeing progress happen, then something can be done. I think we should have no illusions that we're going to see meaningful progress quickly. But I think that if you can have all of these countries who so far have said that they, or at least who signed on to UN Security Council Resolution 2803, indicating that they are wanting to see this problem resolved, not just in the short term, but towards a longer term solution, that is a start. But it was going to require concerted and coordinated effort by the regional actors, by those in Europe who so far are sitting out the board of peace until they understand more. But that itself can be some useful, constructive, collective pressure. If there is collective action by those actors who are sitting this out to try to move it in a direction that would make them feel more comfortable buying in. And if the U.S. maintains sustained attention on this, then it's at least the start that is needed.
That's all the time we have for this week, so we'll have to leave things there. Lucy, thank you very much for joining us on the program again.
Thank you for having me back on.
Thank you as well to our listeners for tuning in, and a big thanks to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Gaza and Israel-Palestine more broadly, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.